When I first moved to Pinewood Crest, I believed I'd found the perfect suburban haven. Located on the outskirts of a growing city, it presented neatly trimmed lawns, winding sidewalks, and tasteful houses painted in neutral shades of cream, gray, and beige. The mailboxes matched in style and color, giving every street a sense of uniformity. I had saved for years to buy a modest home in a quiet community, envisioning a welcoming, peaceful environment. Within my first week, though, I heard rumors about the Homeowners Association's iron-fisted president, Karen Harrington. Some neighbors spoke of her in hushed, cautious tones. "She can be helpful," they'd say diplomatically, "but she's very insistent on following every little rule." I shrugged it off at first. I had no intention of violating any neighborhood bylaws. I planted flowers in the authorized planters, used the recommended garbage bins, and kept my grass at the regulated length. Little did I know that Karen's devotion to uniformity and order would soon veer into personal territory, leading to conflicts that neither I nor my friend, my deaf neighbor, Grace, could have foreseen. It all began innocently enough, with an introduction that revealed Karen's overbearing nature, but not the depths to which she'd interfere in private lives. I remember stepping onto my front porch that morning, tasting the mild scent of freshly cut grass and hearing a distant hum of lawnmowers. The sun glinted off the mailboxes as a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of a nearby elm. Everything seemed serene. With a coffee mug in hand, I waved hello to a passing neighbor, then noticed a tall, stern-faced woman marching down the sidewalk, clutching a clipboard to her chest. She wore a crisp polo shirt embroidered with the HOA logo and carried herself like a commander inspecting her troops. She caught my eye and smiled, though it felt more like a polite, forced grin than genuine warmth. That was my first meeting with Karen Harrington. She wasted little time on small talk, delving straight into the rules. Trash day is Wednesday. Bins must be removed from the curb by 7 p.m. on the same day. No yard decorations over 3 feet tall. All prospective paint changes must be submitted for approval at least 2 weeks in advance. She rattled them off with practiced precision. I nodded, absorbing the instructions, telling myself that following a few rules was a small price for living in a tidy, safe neighborhood. Over the next few weeks, I encountered Karen on her daily patrols around Pinewood Crest. I tried to be friendly, hoping to avoid trouble. Despite her controlling tendencies, I believed it was possible to stay on her good side by simply complying. I soon realized, though, that Karen often went beyond the official guidelines, offering unsolicited critiques. "Your rosebush is leaning out of formation. Your mulch color is not the standard shade recommended by the board." As minor as these remarks seemed, they hinted at a deeper issue. Karen believed she had absolute authority over others' properties and lives. At first, I found her intrusive, but since her critiques barely affected me personally, just minor yard suggestions, I brushed them off. I had no idea how far she would go once she discovered a situation she deemed truly unacceptable. My deaf neighbor, Grace, lived 2 doors down, and an unforeseen event would draw Karen's attention, turning the comfortable streets of Pinewood Crest into a battleground. Not long after settling in, I met Grace Pearson, a warm-hearted woman in her late 20s who had been deaf since birth. She owned a cozy ranch-style house painted a tasteful pale green, a color that presumably met with Karen's grudging approval, I guessed. I first noticed Grace from a distance, waving to me with a broad smile, but not speaking. At the time, I didn't realize she was deaf. I simply waved back, slightly confused by the lack of verbal greeting. Later that week, the reason became clear. I was unloading groceries from my car when Grace walked over, accompanied by another woman carrying a small notepad and wearing a bright, friendly expression. The second woman introduced herself as Melanie, saying she was an American Sign Language, ASL, interpreter. Grace turned to Melanie and started signing. Melanie interpreted, "Hi, my name is Grace. I live 2 houses down. I wanted to welcome you to Pinewood Crest." Smiling, I responded carefully, looking at Grace, but speaking clearly so that Melanie could interpret back into ASL, "Thank you, Grace. I'm so happy to meet you." Grace beamed, signing quickly. Melanie translated, "She's excited to have a new neighbor. She wonders if you like the area so far." The three of us spent a good 10 minutes chatting, forming an immediate bond. Grace explained that she worked remotely for a tech company, designing accessible websites. Sometimes she attended neighborhood social events on her own, but found it easier to join bigger gatherings with an interpreter, especially when complex conversation was expected. She hired Melanie or one of her colleagues if an important meeting or conversation needed live interpreting. Without an interpreter, Grace relied on text messages, gestures, or phone-based apps, but those were less comfortable for extended dialogue. From that day on, I'd occasionally see Grace strolling around the neighborhood, her short hair bobbing in the wind as she took in the scenery. Sometimes she was alone, reading texts or using a sign language app on her phone. Other times, she'd wave to neighbors or stop to sign with Melanie, who accompanied her to events where Grace wanted to be sure of complete communication. I liked them both instantly. Grace was thoughtful, witty, and passionate about deaf accessibility. Melanie was cheerful, patient, and fully dedicated to bridging the communication gap. Little did we realize that Karen's watchful eyes had landed on them. It started subtly. Karen would pause on her daily rounds, observing Grace and Melanie standing on the lawn or in the driveway, signing back and forth. She wore a puzzled expression, as if the presence of an interpreter for a deaf resident was a bizarre novelty that demanded scrutiny. At times, I saw Karen shake her head, scribble notes on her ever-present clipboard. A chill of foreboding coursed through me. I had the distinct impression that in Karen's mind, something was off about these repeated visits, something she would not let stand without interference. Over the next few weeks, Grace's sign language interpreter visits became Karen's favorite topic of whispered conversation. I once overheard Karen talking to a neighbor in hushed tones. "Have you noticed that woman? She stands around in Grace's yard for long stretches, making odd gestures. I'm concerned about what's going on. Could it be a business? We have rules against running commercial operations out of a residence without board approval." When I confronted Karen politely, reminding her that Grace was deaf and needed the interpreter for certain tasks, Karen shrugged. "I understand the concept of deafness," she said curtly. "But do we really need an outside person coming multiple times a week just to stand there in the yard? It's suspicious. I intend to ensure everything is properly regulated." At that moment, I realized Karen had no genuine empathy for Grace's condition. She saw the interpreter's presence as an unauthorized intrusion, a potential bylaw violation, or worse, something that threatened her neat suburban dream. It was the hallmark of an HOA Karen, seizing on a situation that deviated from her definition of normal and trying to forcibly correct it. Meanwhile, Grace, blissfully unaware of Karen's machinations, continued living her life. When a local political candidate came door to door, Grace had Melanie interpret so she could question him about disability access. When the neighborhood had a yard sale, Grace chatted with sellers, again using an interpreter for more complex negotiations. None of us saw any harm except Karen, who watched with mounting disapproval. On a crisp Saturday morning, as I watered my front garden, Karen marched onto my lawn, ignoring typical boundaries. She crossed her arms, glaring at me. "I've seen you spend time with Grace and her so-called assistant." The disdain in her voice for the interpreter bristled me. "Have you noticed anything amiss? Are they charging for services on the property? If so, that's a direct violation of the No Commercial Activity Clause." My temper flared. "Karen," I said calmly, "Melanie isn't running a store. She's providing an essential communication service. Grace is deaf. She hires interpreters for vital interactions. That's protected by federal and state disability laws. The HOA doesn't override the Americans with Disabilities Act." Karen sniffed. "We'll see. If it's truly medical, there should be official documentation. We can't have random individuals loitering around, making neighbors uncomfortable. I won't let Pinewood Crest become a circus of outside visitors." And with that, she turned on her heel, stalking away. I clenched my fists, anger boiling. Loitering? A circus? She was describing a legitimate accessibility measure as if it were vandalism or public nuisance. Part of me wanted to warn Grace, but I knew from prior experience with petty HOAs that Karen's first step would be scouring the bylaws for any angle to penalize them. I decided not to alarm Grace yet, hoping maybe Karen would do some research and realize she was out of line. Instead, Karen's crusade escalated, and we were all caught in the middle. The following Monday, I found a sealed envelope taped to Grace's front door. Since I was on my morning walk, I noticed it before she did. Worried it might be from Karen, I quickly texted Grace, "Check your front door." HOA letter, I think. She emerged, Melanie in tow, and retrieved the letter. They stood on the porch as Grace opened it, scanning the text while Melanie read it aloud. To Ms. Grace Pearson. We have observed repeated visits by an individual engaging in ongoing activities on your property. This violates Section 4.2 of the Pinewood Crest bylaws, which forbids recurring commercial or professional services without explicit HOA board approval. If this matter is not resolved within 14 days, you may face fines or further action. You are required to submit documentation justifying the presence of this individual and clarifying their purpose. Sincerely, Karen Harrington, HOA President. Grace stared at Melanie, who repeated the letter's gist in sign language. A mixture of confusion and distress crossed Grace's face. She asked Melanie to interpret for me. What does she mean by commercial service? This is an interpreter. The ADA says I can have an interpreter. Is she serious? I sighed, nodding. Karen is definitely serious. She thinks everything that's not in the standard HOA scope is a threat. This is probably her attempt to categorize your interpreter visits as some unapproved business. I paused, seeing Grace's hands tremble a bit, frustration mounting. We can fight this. You have legal protections. Melanie chimed in, Grace, we can contact the local deaf advocacy organization or the ADA compliance office if needed. The HOA can't block your right to communication. This is a direct violation of disability rights. Despite reassurance, Grace's eyes shone with anger. She signed quickly, which Melanie interpreted, I've never been targeted like this before. I pay my HOA fees on time. My house is neat. I just need an interpreter for certain tasks. Why is that so hard to accept? I had no immediate comfort to give. Karen, with her blind devotion to what she deemed normal, was on a rampage. We parted ways that morning with a plan. Grace would gather documentation, showing she's deaf and sometimes requires an interpreter for daily tasks or events. She'd also look into contacting an advocacy group if Karen pressed further. Karen's note had opened a new front in the quiet suburbs. But ironically, it would soon provoke broader support for Grace. As word spread, many neighbors sympathized, outraged that the HOA president was challenging a deaf resident's basic communication accommodation. Within days, the rumor mill spun in Pinewood Crest. Did you hear Karen is trying to ban interpreters for that deaf neighbor? I can't believe she's calling a personal service a business. Is that even legal? Most residents I spoke with were appalled. A few defended Karen, claiming she always strove to protect property values and ensure no extraneous foot traffic. But many recognized that attacking a deaf neighbor's interpreter was cruel and likely against the law. One morning, a middle-aged couple, Terrence and Lucy Quinn, came by my house, carrying a homemade sign that read, "We support Grace." They asked if I'd join them in a small protest at the next HOA board meeting. We're planning to gather peacefully outside the community center with these signs, letting Karen know we won't tolerate discrimination, Terrence explained. Lucy added, it's a matter of principle. Grace deserves respect, not harassment. Everyone in this neighborhood should feel welcome. Moved by their conviction, I immediately agreed. I texted Grace about it, and she responded with a flurry of excited signs, as relayed by Melanie. She was both touched and uneasy, not wanting to stoke further conflict, but grateful for the solidarity. Meanwhile, Karen carried on as usual, patrolling the sidewalks with her clipboard, refusing to meet neighbors' eyes if they glared at her in disapproval. 2 days later, a small group of neighbors, 10 people, then 15, then nearly 20, gathered informally at my driveway. Terrence handed out "Support Grace" signs, while Lucy urged everyone to stay calm and respectful. We wanted to show the HOA that we stood with Grace without stooping to insults. Grace herself approached with Melanie. She was teary-eyed, signing, "I never expected so much support. Thank you all. Let's be constructive. I just want to keep living here peacefully." We decided to attend the upcoming monthly HOA meeting in force. The plan: we'd let Grace speak, with Melanie interpreting, about how vital her interpreter is, and ask the board to override Karen's stance. If that failed, we'd threaten to file an ADA complaint. The local news might also be interested in a discriminatory HOA situation. That kind of exposure tends to spook even the most arrogant association. Word reached Karen about the budding resistance. Undeterred, she doubled down. Another letter arrived at Grace's house, more explicitly threatening fines for continued unauthorized professional visits. Karen claimed the presence of an interpreter for routine daily tasks was excessive and unapproved. She demanded a full breakdown of each date and purpose for Melanie's visits, plus a fee for administrative processing. Absurd as it sounded, Karen hammered away, hoping to intimidate Grace into compliance. A few neighbors who were once neutral or pro-Karen started to see her actions as cruel or even paranoid. They confronted her. She retorted by citing sections of the bylaws about home businesses and excess foot traffic. However, these rules never intended to target medical or accessibility accommodations. The more she insisted on labeling an interpreter as a business, the more she revealed her ignorance or prejudice. Meanwhile, Grace prepared documentation from her doctor confirming her deafness, though it seemed absurd to have to prove it to an HOA. She even had a statement from Melanie's interpreting agency attesting that the service was not a business run out of Grace's home, but a reasonable accommodation for an individual with hearing loss. We all knew the legal framework was on Grace's side. But HAs can be stubborn, and Karen in particular thrived on confrontation. As the next HOA meeting approached, tension soared. Our plan to show up with supportive neighbors gained traction. Terrence and Lucy were rallying folks on a private neighborhood social media group, one not controlled by Karen. Grace, though anxious, was determined to speak out. Meanwhile, Karen circulated ominous messages on the official HOA forum, warning about outside individuals trying to circumvent community standards. I worried how far Karen might push. She had a flair for sensationalizing, so would she attempt to levy fines? Threaten legal action? We would soon find out. One thing was certain: with so many neighbors now aware of her discriminatory stance, she wasn't going to get away with it quietly. On a warm Tuesday evening, the Pinewood Crest Community Center buzzed with more activity than usual. Chairs lined the small meeting hall, and a modest stage area held a long table where the HOA board members sat, 5 individuals, Karen at the center. Normally, these monthly meetings drew maybe a dozen residents, but tonight at least 40 people packed the room, many standing at the back. I saw Terrence and Lucy, each holding a rolled-up sign. Others whispered quietly, eyes locked on Karen, who pretended not to notice them. Grace arrived with Melanie by her side, both looking nervous but resolute. As soon as they entered, a soft wave of applause rippled through the crowd. Karen watched, lips pressed in a thin line, brow furrowed. At precisely 7 p.m., Karen rapped a small gavel. "Order, please. Let's begin." She launched into the standard agenda, reading the previous minutes, discussing the community pool maintenance, referencing an upcoming holiday event. The tension in the air was palpable. Finally, after half an hour of routine business, Karen cleared her throat. "Next item, we have concerns regarding recurring visits to Ms. Grace Pearson's residence. This is a potential bylaw violation requiring discussion. Ms. Pearson, are you present?" Grace rose, Melanie stepping forward with her. The hush that fell was electric. Grace lifted her hands, signing calmly, while Melanie interpreted into the microphone. "I'm Grace Pearson. I'm deaf. The person visiting my home is an ASL interpreter who assists me with communication. This is not a business, nor an illegal operation. This is an accommodation I have a legal right to." Karen eyed Grace with a mix of impatience and disdain. "Ms. Pearson, the board acknowledges your condition but remains concerned about the frequency of these visits. Our bylaws prohibit ongoing commercial use. We need to ensure no rules are broken. Melanie's expression hardened as she relayed Karen's words to Grace in sign. Grace replied, her gestures forceful. Melanie's voice came out steady. This is discrimination, plain and simple. The Americans with Disabilities Act ensures my right to an interpreter when needed. You have no grounds to limit that or call it a commercial use. If you attempt to fine me, I will challenge you legally. A rumble of agreement swept the audience. Terrence stood, raising his sign that read, ADA HOA. Lucy followed suit, brandishing, access is a right. Others murmured support. Karen's cheeks reddened, her composure wavering. She tried to maintain authority. Let's not turn this into a spectacle. The board has to consider property values and community comfort. It's suspicious to have an outsider constantly loitering. We can't ignore neighbor complaints about feeling uneasy. At that point, a woman named Patricia, one of the board members, spoke up. Karen, I haven't heard a single complaint from neighbors except you. Ms. Pearson is well liked. As far as I know, no one else is uneasy. Another board member, a man named Robert, nodded. And we can't override the ADA. If Ms. Pearson is deaf, she's entitled to have an interpreter. That's outside the scope of any bylaw. Karen stiffened, flipping through pages on her clipboard. We still have the matter of repeated visits. The bylaw states. Robert interjected, but the bylaw isn't relevant in the face of federal law. We'd lose any legal battle. He looked around at the other board members. I say we drop this. The HOA should not risk a discrimination lawsuit. Are we in agreement? Patricia raised her hand. Agreed. Ms. Pearson's situation is protected under disability law. I see no violation worthy of fines or enforcement. A wave of applause erupted from the crowd, including me. Karen's lips were thin with fury. She hammered the gavel to restore order. Let's put it to a vote among the board, she said, her voice taut. She read a motion to declare Ms. Pearson in violation of the bylaw and proceed with potential fines. Then she called for votes. Karen, yes, we should proceed. Patricia, no. Robert, no. The other two board members, Hillary and Dwayne, also voted no and no. The motion failed 4-1. Another roar of applause rose. Grace, tears of relief welling, signed her gratitude to the board members who voted in her favor. At that point, we all assumed the matter was settled. But Karen glared at the audience, muttering about looking into alternative measures. The meeting adjourned with a triumphant mood for Grace, yet an undercurrent of tension told me Karen wasn't finished. Though the board vote ended the official discussion, Karen soon found other ways to harass Grace. Over the next 2 weeks, neighbors reported seeing Karen taking photos whenever Melanie's car was parked in Grace's driveway. She even began walking around the property's perimeter, as if hunting for any minor infraction, an out-of-place flower pot or a slightly leaning mailbox post. She posted passive-aggressive comments on the official HOA forum about those who exploit legal loopholes to circumvent rules. One particularly unsettling incident happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Grace was hosting a small get-together with a few deaf friends, plus one interpreter for ease of group communication. They sat in her backyard, chatting in sign. Suddenly, Karen appeared at the fence line, videotaping them on her phone. Terrence, who was also a guest, confronted her, demanding she stop filming. Karen retreated, scowling. That same evening, Grace received an email from the HOA's official address, but clearly authored by Karen, complaining of noise disturbances and unauthorized gatherings. Lucy, who was also there, told me that the only noise had been gentle laughter. The real problem, it seemed, was Karen's obsession with Grace's deaf social circle, interpreting it as some suspicious phenomenon. At this juncture, Grace spoke to a lawyer from the local deaf advocacy group. They assured her that if Karen tried imposing fines or continuing targeted harassment, Grace could file a formal complaint under the Fair Housing Act and the ADA. The lawyer recommended documenting everything: emails, photos, witness statements. Despite the board's official stance, Karen's personal vendetta burned. She might not impose fines unilaterally, but she could sow chaos, feeding rumors, or confronting guests. A sense of anxiety hovered over Grace's once peaceful home. In the background, however, a wave of neighborly support grew stronger. People were outraged by Karen's blatant discrimination. Some started discussing whether they could recall Karen from the HOA presidency, a process that required a majority vote of the membership. The notion was gaining traction. Anger toward Karen spread throughout Pinewood Crest. Families who had once tolerated her strict rule now realized the cruelty of her current crusade. A deaf neighbor sign language interpreter was not a blight on property values, it was a normal, lawful accommodation. Karen's behavior felt not just overbearing, but downright prejudiced. Robert, the board member who had spoken out in Grace's defense, quietly approached me with an update. Karen's been contacting some residents, trying to build a case that the interpreter's presence is scaring them or lowering their sense of security. It's nonsense, but she's determined. He shook his head. A few folks might side with her, but most see this as beyond the pale. Patricia emailed the board, proposing an official censure against Karen. She argued that Karen was misusing her role to harass a resident. While a censure wouldn't remove Karen from the presidency automatically, it would publicly denounce her. It's time we stood up for what's right, Patricia wrote. Grace is fully within her rights to have an interpreter. We can't let Karen's personal prejudices overshadow the association's integrity. In parallel, Terrence and Lucy ramped up efforts to gather signatures for a recall petition. I helped them gather dozens of neighbors' support. The idea, if enough homeowners demanded it, the HOA's bylaws allowed for a special meeting to vote on removing Karen as president. In the past, such recall attempts often failed due to fear or apathy. But this time, Karen had awakened a moral outrage. Grace herself was caught in a swirl of emotions. She disliked conflict, but refused to be victimized. With Melanie's help, she posted a heartfelt message on the neighborhood's social media page. She explained her deafness, the necessity of interpreters, and her desire to live peacefully. The post concluded, "I love Pinewood Crest. I respect the rules. But I can't be singled out just because I'm deaf. I hope the community stands for inclusion." The outpouring of empathy was immediate and overwhelming. Karen, of course, responded in her typical fashion, calling Grace's statement one-sided and incomplete. She questioned whether an interpreter was truly needed so often. She repeated the phrase, "This is a residential area, not a place for daily professional services." People blasted her in the comments, telling her she was ignoring basic disability rights. She locked the thread, claiming it had become toxic. Day by day, the tension soared. It was only a matter of time before everything came to a head, leading either to Karen's downfall or some uneasy compromise. But Karen was too obstinate for compromise, and the neighborhood had grown too indignant to let her reign continue. Just when it seemed Karen couldn't stoop lower, she staged a snap inspection of Grace's property under the pretext of routine compliance checks. Typically, the HOA scheduled such inspections in advance, with courtesy notices. But Karen appeared unannounced on a Friday afternoon with two other board members in tow. The pair were clearly uncomfortable. Robert later told me Karen strong-armed them, claiming it was urgent. Karen marched into Grace's backyard, scanning every corner while Grace and Melanie looked on in disbelief. Karen muttered about the presence of unauthorized modifications. She pointed to a small shed in the corner, claiming it might not meet setback requirements. Grace, through Melanie, explained the shed had been there for years, originally approved by a previous board. Karen insisted on measuring. She withdrew a tape measure, fussing over inches from the fence. The other board members exchanged glances, apologizing to Grace with their eyes. Finding nothing amiss with the shed, Karen turned her attention to the back patio. She tapped her foot on a new set of stepping stones that Grace had installed for decorative flair. "Were these additions cleared by the architectural committee?" she demanded. Grace was flabbergasted, signing rapidly. "They're just stones, not a permanent structure." "Why the fuss?" Melanie conveyed Grace's protest, but Karen simply scribbled on her clipboard. The ordeal lasted nearly an hour, with Karen meticulously documenting every inch of the yard. The real aim was intimidation, not actual bylaw enforcement. In the end, Karen found no legitimate violations. The other board members offered no official complaint, departing quietly. Karen, however, sniffed haughtily. "We'll be in touch," she said, leaving Grace near tears, exhausted by the blatant harassment. As news spread, the neighborhood's outrage grew. Even residents who disliked drama agreed Karen was harassing Grace under false pretenses. Patricia called an emergency board meeting to address improper conduct by the president. The petition for Karen's recall was nearing the threshold required to trigger a special election. Everyone sensed the storm was about to break. That weekend, Grace's lawyer friend from the deaf advocacy group visited her, dropping off official forms for potential legal action. The lawyer explained that if Grace wished, she could file an immediate complaint with the U.S. Department of Justice under the ADA or pursue a Fair Housing Act complaint for discrimination. In parallel, the lawyer could request a restraining order if Karen's intrusions continued. This was serious business, far beyond the usual petty HOA disputes over paint colors or trash bins. Grace weighed her options. She wanted the harassment to end, but didn't relish a drawn-out legal fight. The deaf advocacy group offered full support, even potential media coverage if it would help protect Grace's rights. Many neighbors urged her to proceed, convinced it was the only way to stop Karen. However, with the upcoming board meeting and the near certainty of a recall vote, Grace decided to wait a little longer. If the community removes Karen, that might solve the problem, she told me via Melanie's interpretation. "I don't want to escalate unless I must." I admired her restraint, though I worried Karen might do something even more extreme in the meantime. The neighbors prepared for the next official board meeting, a potential showdown. Our recall petition was only a handful of signatures shy of the required number. Terrence and Lucy worked tirelessly, knocking on doors, explaining the situation, gathering support. We all hoped we'd soon see Karen dethroned from her self-appointed kingdom. But as the meeting date approached, tension crackled like static in the air. On the evening of the scheduled HOA board meeting, the small community center was packed with residents. Some carried signs reading, "HOA for all, deaf rights are human rights, and don't discriminate." Others simply folded their arms in discontent, glaring at Karen when she arrived. The board members, Robert, Patricia, Hillary, and Dwayne, looked wary, but determined to address the growing crisis. Karen took her seat at the center of the table, expression steely. She banged her gavel. "Order," she said curtly. "We have a full agenda tonight, so let's proceed quickly." She tried to push the usual mundane matters, landscaping budgets, community pool hours, etc. Meanwhile, people in the audience grew restless, eager to address the main issue. Finally, halfway through, Patricia stood and announced, "I move that we address the standing complaints against President Harrington regarding her treatment of Ms. Pearson and the alleged misuse of her position." Karen's eyes narrowed. "That's not on the agenda, Patricia. We should wait until after scheduled business." Robert chimed in, "It's on the minds of everyone here. We can discuss it now." Cheers erupted from the audience. Karen huffed, flipping through her notes, but Patricia had the floor. "We have numerous requests from residents to hold a recall vote. Additionally, I'd like to note that Ms. Harrington's repeated actions targeting Ms. Pearson, snap inspections, videotaping, threatening letters, constitute harassment. I propose we consider a motion to censure Ms. Harrington and schedule a recall election." At once, the crowd roared in approval. A few of Karen's allies tried to protest, but were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of voices. Terrence and Lucy stood, brandishing their petition. "We have enough signatures right now for the recall," Lucy declared, brandishing the papers. "Karen Harrington no longer represents this community's values." Karen's composure cracked. She pounded the gavel again. "Order. This is a hijacking of the meeting. You can't just..." But Patricia continued resolutely. "The bylaws state if a petition meets a certain threshold, the board must schedule a special meeting for a recall vote. We have more than that threshold, do we not?" She looked at Terrence and Lucy. They nodded vigorously, holding up the petition for all to see. Karen insisted, "We need to verify signatures. This is a witch hunt." I only enforce the rules for the betterment of Pinewood Crest. A voice from the back piped up, banning a deaf interpreter is not betterment. Another shouted, stop discrimination, Karen. The tension exploded into a cacophony. Robert, stepping in with a measured voice, said, everyone, calm down. The board will verify the petition. If valid, we'll schedule the recall. Until then, I move we pass an immediate resolution preventing any further fines or actions against Ms. Pearson. Anyone second? Patricia, Dwayne, and Hillary all raised hands. The motion carried. The room cheered. Karen fumed, muttering about chaos and outrageous demands. The meeting ended in a swirl of excitement and relief for Grace, but with the recall process now officially in motion, Karen's fate hung in the balance. She stormed out, ignoring residents' stares. Meanwhile, Grace, tears in her eyes, signed her gratitude. Thank you all. We're so close to ending this. Though the tide turned against her, Karen refused to back down quietly. She took to the HOA's official email system, bombarding residents with messages portraying herself as a victim. She accused Grace and her interpreter of staging a rebellion. She claimed the recall was fueled by lies and insisted she had the moral high ground. The letters had an unhinged quality, referencing safety concerns from unknown visitors, implying that interpreters for the deaf were shady characters skulking around the neighborhood. Most people saw through her desperation. A few residents who disliked drama found themselves swayed by her fearmongering, but not nearly enough to halt the momentum of the recall. Meanwhile, the board verified the petition, confirming the required signatures. They scheduled a special recall meeting for 2 weeks hence, giving everyone time to prepare and discuss the matter. If the majority of homeowners present voted to remove Karen, she would lose her presidency immediately. Karen also tried to contact the local police, claiming suspicious loitering by interpreters around Grace's home. The police took a cursory look and found no wrongdoing. They told Karen that private sign language interpreting was not a criminal matter. She was left looking foolish, though not deterred. Through it all, Grace pressed on with her normal life. She hired Melanie or other interpreters as needed, refusing to hide or scale back her accommodations. Neighbors regularly stopped by to check on her or to see if any new harassment had emerged. The deaf advocacy lawyer kept a watchful eye, ready to file charges if Karen attempted more direct action. We all braced ourselves for the upcoming recall. Typically, these processes fail when an HOA president wields intimidation. But Karen had gone too far, alienating too many with her hostility toward a deaf neighbor. This time, it seemed the community was ready to stand up for justice. On a muggy Thursday evening, over half the homeowners in Pinewood Crest assembled at the community center for the recall. The turnout was unprecedented. People squeezed into every seat, lined the walls, or spilled into the hallway. Karen sat at the front, flanked by the other board members, her face a mask of defiance. Robert welcomed everyone, explaining the recall procedure. Each side would have a chance to speak, then votes would be cast. If a majority voted for removal, Karen would be ousted as president. If not, she would remain, presumably emboldened. Karen spoke first, delivering a tense monologue about her years of service, claiming she ensured property values soared. She brandished a handful of letters from an alleged minority of residents who shared her concerns about strange visitors. She ended with a shrill assertion, "I have always acted in the best interest of Pinewood Crest." This so-called recall is an attack on law and order, orchestrated by people who don't appreciate what I do. Some polite applause came from a small cluster of her loyal supporters. The rest of the room remained silent or bristled in disapproval. Then Terrence, representing the petition organizers, calmly laid out the case for removal. He listed examples of Karen's overreach, culminating in her harassment of Grace. Lucy chimed in about how Karen tried to ban interpreters, even calling them suspicious. Patricia read from the board's censure motion, highlighting how Karen's actions violated anti-discrimination principles. The crowd murmured in agreement. Finally, Grace stood with Melanie by her side. The hush in the room was total as Grace signed her statement. Melanie's voice trembled with emotion. I moved here for peace and community. I never expected to fight an HOA president over my right to an interpreter. My deafness is not a threat or a business. My interpreter is crucial for me to communicate. Karen's campaign has made me feel unsafe and unwelcome in my own home. I love Pinewood Crest, but I cannot thrive under such hostility. Sniffles rose among listeners. Many dabbed at tears. The raw sincerity of Grace's words cut through any confusion. This was the human cost of Karen's vendetta. The point was made. Pinewood Crest had to choose between supporting basic human dignity or endorsing Karen's tyranny. With that, ballots were distributed. Each homeowner in good standing cast a secret vote. Yes to remove Karen, no to keep her. The tension was palpable as volunteers tallied the votes at a folding table. Karen sat rigidly, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. After a painstaking half-hour, the vote counters brought the results to Robert. He cleared his throat, reading from a slip of paper. Total votes cast, 142. Votes needed to remove Karen, 72. Simple majority. Yes to remove, 108. No to remove, 34. A roar of excitement erupted. Grace gasped, tears shining in her eyes. I found myself hugging neighbors in relief. The margin wasn't even close. Karen was thoroughly defeated. Patricia announced solemnly, by majority vote, Karen Harrington is hereby recalled from the presidency of Pinewood Crest Homeowners Association. Effective immediately, the vice president will act as interim. Karen sat stunned. She tried to sputter a protest. You can't. I've led this HOA for, but the echo of the cheers drowned her out. People began chanting inclusion, not discrimination. Robert politely asked her to relinquish her gavel and step aside. She slammed it on the table, then stomped out, refusing to address the crowd. Her loyal supporters followed, looking dejected. For the rest of us, it was a cathartic moment. The tyranny had ended, and the community had rallied behind Grace's right to accommodation. Neighbors congratulated her, reaffirming that Pinewood Crest was for everyone. Despite the drama, we parted that night with renewed faith in the power of unity against bigotry. Karen's removal as president was just the beginning of her punishment. With the formal recall done, the board quickly convened a special session to decide on potential disciplinary measures. They discovered that Karen had misused HOA letterhead to send threatening notices without full board consent. She'd also filmed residents on private property. These actions violated multiple sections of the HOA's Code of Conduct. Within a week, the board voted to censure Karen officially. They stripped her of any committee roles and barred her from running for a board position for a minimum of 5 years. Robert, now the interim president, drafted a letter to the entire neighborhood outlining the reasons for Karen's censure. Harassment and discrimination against a deaf resident. Unauthorized inspections and data collection. Abuse of authority by distributing threats without board approval. Moreover, the new board decided to waive any fees or fines Karen had threatened to impose on Grace. They encouraged Grace to stay vigilant, promising no further interference with interpreters. The deaf advocacy lawyer commended Pinewood Crest for taking swift corrective action, so Grace decided not to pursue a formal complaint with the DOJ or fair housing provided Karen left her alone. This saved the HOA from a legal quagmire, which the board recognized as an act of goodwill by Grace. Meanwhile, Karen faced the fallout from her neighbors. Many no longer greeted her, some openly shunned her. A few older residents still clung to her side, lamenting her downfall, but the majority recognized that her brand of leadership had cost the community trust, time, and public embarrassment. Rumors swirled that Karen might sell her house and move away to start fresh, though she hadn't made any official statement. In the weeks following Karen's ouster, Pinewood Crest felt different, lighter, more welcoming. Robert, Patricia, and the rest of the board held an open house forum where residents could voice concerns without fear. They discussed revising the bylaws to clarify that legitimate accommodations, like sign language interpreters, caregivers, or other disability-related assistance, were exempt from the commercial use clause. Grace's relief was palpable. She no longer jumped at shadows, worried that Karen might appear with a camera. She invited neighbors to small gatherings, bridging any misunderstandings about deaf culture. Melanie, her interpreter, became a friendly fixture who felt comfortable in the neighborhood. Many folks introduced themselves properly, learning a few basic signs to greet Grace. It was a testament to how a community can adapt and embrace diversity once the barriers of prejudice are removed. Word spread of the changes. Some families, hearing that Pinewood Crest overcame an ugly discrimination case, became interested in moving here, praising the sense of unity that had emerged. I could never have imagined, on the day I moved in, that a major conflict with the HOA president would eventually lead to a stronger, more empathetic neighborhood. Yet that was exactly what happened. One might think Karen would quietly accept defeat. Instead, she made one final attempt at retribution. A month after her recall, she posted on the Pinewood Crest official forum, still accessible to all residents, an aggressive rant. She railed against the board's unfair censure, called Grace's interpreter situation a scam to exploit community sympathy, and threatened to sue for defamation. However, she no longer had admin privileges to moderate or lock comments. Neighbors responded with fury. They pointed out her repeated discriminatory actions, the board's unanimous condemnation, the near-unanimous vote to remove her. Some posted links to the ADA website, highlighting the legal foundation for Grace's rights. Others simply told Karen to move on. Eventually, the board, in the interest of communal peace, removed her post for violating guidelines against harassment. Karen's words had lost all weight. No one was buying her self-victimization narrative anymore. After that, Karen went quiet. People saw less of her on the streets. The rumor that she was listing her house for sale resurfaced, bolstered by sightings of realtors near her property. The once mighty HO president was now a pariah, undone by her own prejudice and refusal to accept that deaf individuals have every right to effective communication. By early autumn, Pinewood Crest had fully adjusted to life post-Karen. The board replaced her with a new, more inclusive leadership style. At the next neighborhood block party, Grace strolled among the booths with Melanie, chatting easily with everyone from children to seniors. People showed genuine interest in learning some basic signs, like, hello, thank you, or nice to meet you. The sense of warmth that had been overshadowed by Karen's negativity now flourished. One crisp afternoon, I noticed a moving truck parked outside Karen's house. The blinds were drawn. Within a day, the truck left and Karen's car was gone. Some neighbors saw her driving away, refusing all farewells. A "for sale" sign popped up on the lawn the following morning, courtesy of a local realtor. And thus, Karen's chapter in Pinewood Crest closed with quiet finality. The board made one last gesture to emphasize the new era. They passed a resolution reaffirming that any resident with a disability is entitled to accommodations, including interpreters, caregivers, or mobile ITY aids, without fear of harassment or additional scrutiny. A letter to that effect went out to all residents, signed by Robert and Patricia, stating, "Pinewood Crest is a community for everyone." Grace read that letter with a grateful smile. She told me, through Melanie, that she finally felt truly at home. All the fear, frustration, and conflict had ended in a victory for compassion and understanding. Those scars remained. The neighborhood had grown from the ordeal. Karen's final punishment was threefold. Recall and removal. She lost her position as HOA president by a resounding community vote. Censure and barring. The board formally censured her, and she was forbidden from holding any HOA office for 5 years. Social fallout. Her discriminatory behavior led to widespread condemnation. Few people stood by her. Facing isolation, she eventually moved away, her attempts to reassert control utterly broken. Months passed. Winter's chill gave way to the first blooms of spring. I walked past Grace's house, noticing her garden now vibrantly alive with tulips and daffodils. No sign of Karen's disapproving glare, no presence of fear. Grace emerged, waved in greeting, a wide grin on her face. Melanie was inside, sipping tea at the kitchen table, helping Grace plan a deaf community meetup at the local park. The board had even offered to sponsor the event. In that moment, I reflected on how a single act of prejudice could have destroyed a sense of community, but instead it galvanized neighbors to stand for what was right. Grace's quiet strength, combined with the moral conviction of those around her, turned the tide against an HOA leader who forgot the core principle of any neighborhood: respect for each individual's dignity and rights. Standing there in the gentle sunshine, hearing the birds chirp and catching glimpses of neighbors walking dogs or chatting amiably, I realized Pinewood Crest was not perfect, but it had proven its capacity for growth and unity. We had cast off the shadow of a Karen who tried to impose her will on a deaf neighbor's interpreter. The final outcome was a testament to how empathy and solidarity can triumph over the pettiness of one who sought to control. And so it ended. Karen punished by her own downfall, with the neighborhood free at last from her overbearing rule, and Grace living in peace, interpreter at her side whenever she wished. An enduring sign of hope in a suburban world that sometimes needed a wake-up call to remember its humanity.